The rain started when the salesman walked off to grab numbers. I sat in the driver's seat of a new minivan, letting the dealership lights wash over me like I was part of someone else's story. Then my husband's voice came through the car speakers. "After November, we're done," he said. "She's useful till the election. Voters love a nurse wife. I don't touch her unless I have to." I didn't blink. I didn't move. I just listened. He said a name, Portfield. He said, "Clerk won't look twice." He said, "File the trust amendments after the vote." I'm a nurse. I live on facts. And that night, I made a promise. No more asking if you're mad. I'm bringing receipts. The next morning, I walked into the county building with coffee and a calm smile. "I'm trying to understand how purchasing works," I said. The clerk turned her screen just enough for me to see a name, Portfield Consulting. And right there, under Opposition Containment, Churches and Nurse Voices, I found the first crack. Later, at the hospital, I spotted a flyer for the redevelopment of Golden Acres, the seniors' home. At the bottom was the same name, Portfield Consulting. That's when I realized it wasn't just about me. It was about every quiet person being moved off the map by men who thought we wouldn't notice. So here's what happens when a fat woman you don't touch decides to touch the truth. I took the mic, I read the dates, I said the names. And a judge looked at my husband and said, "We're not doing that here." My name is Nora. I won't shrink. Stay, watch what receipts can do. At 5:30 the next morning, the round-robin diners smelled like bacon and rain-damp coats, like a place where secrets lived in coffee cups and never spilled unless you tipped them over yourself. Ruth, who had braided silver hair and eyes that could see through a closed door, poured Nora coffee and left the pot without asking. "You look like a woman who wants to speak and isn't sure if today is the day," Ruth said, leaning into the booth just enough to make it intimacy and not intrusion. "I want proof," Nora said, surprising herself by letting the words out where someone else could touch them. "Proof is just truth with receipts," Ruth said, as if she were telling Nora where to find the sugar caddies. "How do I get receipts?" Nora asked, almost laughing at the absurdity of having to ask. Ruth pulled the receipt from the printer and flipped it over. With a pen behind her ear, she wrote, "Public records, purchasing, vendor detail, cross-reference donors, FOIA. Then she wrote 2 words underlined twice, "Ask nicely." "The county website's a maze," she said, "but the clerk's office is human. Bring coffee." Nora nodded and felt for a moment like a person who could actually move her own life by pushing on it. Maple County Hospital had taught her how paper lived and died. She knew how to ask a question a man in a suit wanted to answer. At 8 o'clock, when the county building unlocked its glass mouth, she walked in with a carrier of black coffees and practiced her nurse voice on the front desk. A voice made of calm and small facts that could not be argued with. "I'm trying to understand how purchasing works. I'm on a committee at the hospital, but the website confuses me. I'd love to understand vendor details and how they're coded." The clerk wore a cardigan the color of pencil erasers and had a hinge of empathy that suggested she had one kid who worried her, one parent who called too much, and a tendency to take on other people's fights without admitting it. "It confuses us all," she said, eyes bright with the pleasure of being useful. "What vendor?" Nora swallowed the name as if it might burn her. She said, "Portfield Consulting." The clerk, her name tag said Denise, typed with short, decisive strokes and frowned the way people frown when they find something that is technically not their business and obviously should be. She made a face that was a smile with no teeth, then turned the monitor a degree to the left, not enough to be improper and enough to be generous. "Busy bee," she murmured, eyes on the screen. On a list Nora could not see clearly enough to read, she recognized the shape of a pattern. Portfield invoicing for stakeholder analysis, for opposition containment, for care pathway consulting. There were parcel numbers and dates. She wrote down what she could in the margins of the meeting agenda she had carried in like a shield, heart doing a low drum behind her throat. She did not ask for copies, not yet. She thanked Denise with a kind of gratitude that made people want to do more. In the hallway, she pressed her head against the cool, painted cinder block and thought of a woman at the dealership who listened to her own life as if it were happening to someone else through a speaker. On her lunch break, she drove quilts to Golden Acres Assisted Living because the hospital auxiliary had called and asked if she could, and saying yes to small things had always been easier than saying no to large ones. Golden Acres had lemon cleaner in its bones and soup in its air. The hallways were the beige of forgetfulness. In room 112, a tiny woman named Millie asked Nora to change the TV from true crime to baseball. "I can't sleep with people getting chased," she said, voice thin and precise. "Baseball's gentler," Nora said, changing the channel to the Yankees without asking if Millie was a Yankees fan, and earning a small, surprised laugh. On her way out, she stopped to look at the bulletin board by the fish tank where a plastic castle collected algae and bubbles. There were flyers for family night, for chair yoga, for Medicare counseling. There was one she hadn't seen before. Redevelopment proposal, Golden Acres, parcel public hearing, Monday. At the bottom, and typed small enough to pretend not to be seen, was a contact, Portfield Consulting, LLC, with a phone number and a website that looked like it had been designed to say, "We are legitimate," without telling you what they did. Nora took a picture and then took the whole flyer, sliding it into her tote with the quilt she'd failed to hand out because she'd stopped to talk to Millie about her sister who died in '83. Seed planted, the story in her blood said, and she pressed her hand flat against the tote like she could keep the paper from making noise. Sunday, after church, she had walked in late and stood in the back in case she needed to leave without being blessed by a greeter. She found a sticky note on Grant's laptop, Nov 9, filed trust amendments after swearing in. There was a smiley face drawn at the end in a hand that wasn't his. She set the note back where it had been. In the laundry room, she found a dry cleaning ticket in his suit jacket pocket. On the back, someone had scribbled, "Call Jenna after victory party, T&C ready." She Googled Jenna plus estate planning plus Maple County and sat on the edge of the tub staring at the cracked grout, thinking about how many times she had asked, "Are you mad at me?" when the question had been, "Am I allowed to be angry?" Silence as machine, she told herself. Silence can build, not just swallow. At the hospital, she stayed late to cover for a nurse whose toddler had a fever. She walked past a woman sleeping in a chair beside her husband's bed and put a blanket over the woman's knees without waking her. In the staff lounge, she ate a peanut butter sandwich because there wasn't time to order anything, and the cafeteria had stopped serving hot food at 7. She loved the lounge because the microwave clock didn't match anyone else's sense of time. She hated the lounge because that was where people spoke the truth in ways you could not afford to listen to when you were in a room with a patient who couldn't breathe. Grant texted a photo of his suit hanging on a door with the words, "You're the best." She stared at the screen until it went black and then sat with her hands in her lap like a person taking attendance of her own body parts. When the FOIA reply landed in her email 14 days after she asked, she was in the round robin with an omelet she had not intended to eat and a cup of coffee that had lost its heat to conversation. The subject line was Public Records Request, Redevelopment Correspondence, and the attachment sounded like very simple forms of very complicated harm. Parcel 12B Golden Acres, Phase Out Timeline, Public Narrative Talking Points, Bond Messaging Test. Nora opened one and read an email thread with Portfield where someone wrote opposition containment, churches and nurse voices, as if churches were weather and nurse voices were a substance you shoveled off your driveway.
She printed the emails at the hospital on her break and felt disloyal to a printer, which made her laugh in a way that wasn't laughter. Ruth set down blueberry pie on the house and sat across from her without asking for permission that didn't need to be asked for. Ruth said, "You found something," and made it not a question. Nora said, "I found the outline." Ruth listened like people listened when they intended to carry something with you. She said, "You know what the outline needs," she said gently, and Nora said, "Receipts," and felt her mouth go dry around the word. Ruth reached across and touched Nora's knuckles with 2 fingers, and she said, "You bring coffee to the right desk and keep your voice low. Men in suits think truth is a volume problem. It's not." Grant's mother, Bev, sent links to articles about candidate wives who glow up and texted a photo of a belt she said would snatch the green dress. A stylist showed up at the house one afternoon with swatches and a voice like a lullaby for people who love themselves too brightly. She said, "We'll cinch here," hands hovering around Nora's waist as if she were moving a lampshade. Nora laughed in the polite, brittle way she had been trained by dinner parties to laugh and said, "I'm not sure I want to be rearranged today." The stylist blinked as if someone had said a word she didn't know how to spell, then smiled the way people smile when they refuse a fact.
In the laundry room, where she kept her private disappointments on a shelf labeled detergent, Nora found a letter from the bank addressed to Grant with an invitation to a donor appreciation breakfast. She put it under her legal pad and wrote under her list, "Meet with Temple and Crane." Leela Crane had sued the county for denying elder care funding 5 years ago and won quietly. Nora had admired her the way you admire weather that saves you from a drought. At Betty's on Main, a diner with a neon coffee cup that flickered like it was trying to live, she asked Grant if they could have pancakes because she was tired of eggs at home and wanted a room with other people in it. He ordered coffee and charmed the waitress by asking about her grandkids because he had learned that you could load kindness like a bullet and use it to define yourself. "Do you ever think about what happens to the seniors if the parcel gets developed?" Nora asked when the pancakes arrived, cutting her stack into small squares because her mother had taught her that small bites make you look graceful, and also she had a small mouth. "They'll be fine," Grant said. "The market adjusts." "They're not the market," she said, and watched him point at his fork to emphasize growth, like growth was a word you could eat. "You've always been too sentimental," he said, using his campaign voice on her, like a hairdryer set to warm. "We need to think about the future." "Whose?" she asked, and he didn't answer, because that wasn't the future he meant. The public hearing at the library auditorium smelled like old paper and the underside of hope. Folding chairs filled the carpeted rectangle, and someone had taken the time to put a potted plant on either side of the podium so the room would look polite in photos. Nora wore the green dress because it did, in fact, forgive, and she sat in the back near the fire extinguisher because knowing where the fire extinguisher was calmed her. Grant stood at the podium and said, "Underutilized assets," like he was in charge of mercy. People clapped because the men in suits clapped. Nora felt the emails in her tote like a heartbeat. Her phone buzzed with a text from Ruth. "Breathe in 4, out 6. Halfway through, a staffer slipped a folded program into Nora's hand without looking at her. Inside, in tiny handwriting, were 2 words, "Wrong folder." She tilted the program toward the door and saw Denise, the clerk, in the doorway with a face like a question that had learned to walk. On the agenda, next to item 4, vendor report, someone had drawn a star. When they opened the floor for public comment, Nora stood. The aisle felt like a balancing beam, and she had never been good at gymnastics. The microphone had that metallic smell microphones get when they've listened to the same sentence too many times.
She held the papers tight because her hands had started to shake, and she didn't want the shaking to read as fear. "My name is Nora Henderson," she said, and her voice sounded like a person who knows how to call a code blue and say the right things to make other people move. "I'm a nurse at Maple County Hospital. My mother taught me that truth without receipts is just a story. I brought receipts." She didn't shout. She read subject lines. She read dates. She read opposition containment, churches and nurse voices, and then said very softly, "Those churches have names. Those nurses have bodies. That opposition is Millie in room 112 who watches baseball and cries when she's cold." The murmuring in the room changed shape. It stopped being a murmur and started being a collected breath. A reporter near the wall leaned forward. Grant's smile failed. It didn't crack, it dissolved, like sugar in hot tea. He stepped to the microphone with his apology face and said, "We'll review," but people were already standing to ask questions that didn't appear in his notes. Outside, under the glare of a street lamp that made everyone look like they were telling the truth, Ruth wrapped Nora in a hug that smelled of coffee and hand cream. She said, "Sunrise. Whatever comes, you made it to the light." What came was a storm with teeth. A local paper ran a story with 3 photos, Grant at a podium, the Golden Acre sign, and Nora at the microphone caught mid-breath. A TV van parked on our street until Nora pulled into the garage and closed the door. Bev texted, "Are you okay?" with a heart and a prayer hands and a link to a line of shapewear. Grant stood in the kitchen with his tie loose, like a man who'd been strangled by his own reflection. "You will fix this," he said, and there wasn't a please anywhere in the room. "No," Nora said, realizing that the word tasted like a fruit she had used to love and had forgotten. "I will finish this."
She walked down the hall to their bedroom, reached for the shoebox on the top shelf of the closet, and set it on the bed. Inside were things that had not been invited into her marriage. A letter her mother wrote in 2012 that said, "If you ever need to start over, here's a key to my old place over Betty's. It's paid off. They never tore it down." There was a church card and the Lake Erie photo where she stood on the pier with her arms open to a sky that didn't owe her anything. There were spare keys threaded onto a ribbon. That night, while Grant slept face down like a boy who had never learned to say sorry, Nora packed 2 totes, documents, scrubs, the locket, 2 pairs of jeans, a sweater that forgave nothing and was still her favorite. On the kitchen table, she left a note she did not sign. "No more asking if you're mad." She put the pen down beside the note like she was returning a borrowed thing. Betty's on Main wore its neon coffee cup like a badge. The upstairs door was in the alley where the cook smoked on break and where the dumpsters smelled like last night's onions. The apartment smelled like dust and old cinnamon, like a place that had held furniture with personality. The windows shook when trucks passed on Main Street. The radiator hissed like a cat with boundaries. She put a quilt on the bed and sat down slowly because the bed was low and she had a knee that didn't bend without telling her about it first. She cried ugly for 5 minutes because ugly crying was honest and she had run out of space for pretty. In the morning, she put on the locket. She touched it and didn't make a wish because she wasn't 12 anymore and wishes were work when you were a grown woman. Grant did what men like Grant do. He hired a crisis manager who had teeth he probably flossed after each client. He issued a statement that said categorically an unfounded and personal matter. He went on the radio and told a man who said folks a lot that his wife was struggling emotionally. He suggested she had a condition. Nora smiled without humor at the radio in the kitchenette and thought about conditions that didn't come with prescriptions. She called Temple and Crane and asked for Leela. "I have a timeline, I have receipts, I don't have money for a retainer," she said, practicing being the kind of person who said what was true even when it sounded like she was asking for too much. Leela said, "You have facts. Come in at 2, bring your nurse brain." Back at Golden Acres, Millie had taped a note to her bedside table. "Don't let them move me, please." The letters looked like they were trying to stand up straight and not succeeding. Nora pressed the paper to her chest because bodies need to be touched to keep from flying away. In the sunroom, where the light was kind because it had been filtered by other people's sorrows, Nora recorded a video on her phone. "My name is Nora," and the way she said her own name made her want to try it on again later. "I'm a nurse. I'm here because people with soft voices don't always get heard. If you care about the folks in buildings nobody photographs, show up Thursday at the courthouse." She posted it on Facebook and didn't check the comments. Ruth texted 20 minutes later, "It's walking around the internet with house shoes." She sent a screenshot of the video being shared by a church choir director and by a woman who sold Avon and by someone's cousin who taught 4th grade. The courthouse hearing was about procurement and disclosure. It was also, in a way, everyone understood and no one would admit about whether women who had apologized their way through most of their adult lives were allowed to stop. The judge wore sharp glasses and hummed under her breath while she read, the way some people hum when they're deciding if a pie is done. Nora took the oath and said yes to her own name, like a person being introduced to a version of herself she wanted to sit next to at a party. The county council asked polite questions about emails and invoices. Nora answered in full sentences and didn't apologize for knowing things. She said narrative and line item. She said this invoice is for messaging, while this email says containment. She didn't mention her marriage because the hearing wasn't about marriage, and she refused to give Grant the comfort of thinking anything ever had been. When it was Grant's turn, he had 2 options, apologize or attack, and he chose the one he knew. "My wife." "Miss Henderson," the judge said without looking up. He struggled. Ruth coughed in the back row. It sounded like a threat wrapped in a cookie. The judge set down her pen and gave Grant the look good teachers give good-looking boys. "We're not doing that here," she said, and you could hear 20 women in the room smile without moving their faces. By afternoon, the judge had ordered a hold on payments to Portfield and referred certain emails to the state auditor. Outside, wind lifted papers in the square and sent them sliding like pale leaves. Reporters wanted quotes. Nora said, "There are easier ways to start over than blowing up your life." I couldn't find one. And a woman in a church sweatshirt took her hand and said her mother was at Golden Acres, and thank you. Blueport started the next Saturday behind Betty's on the cracked patio where the cook smoked and where a cat that nobody had adopted but everybody fed slept on a stack of milk crates like royalty. Ruth found a bench at a yard sale and painted it blue because porches and stories are always places where you can breathe, and because blue is the color the sky uses to tell you it didn't forget you. They put a donation box under the counter with a sign that said rent help, legal clinic, rides. They put a flyer board by the door with tear-off tabs, Temple and Crane, free consults, know your rights, tenants, church basement clothes swap, AA meets Tuesday, Thursday, 7 p.m., women's group, Sundays, 4 p.m. It wasn't a 501c3 yet. It was coffee and clipped articles and women saying, "Me too," and here's what worked. And a pastor from Nora's church bringing folding chairs that still had tape with last names written on them. Denise from the clerk's office brought muffins and a list of search terms that made sense in a world where tax parcels had become methods for getting rid of people who took up space. Millie sent a note through the activities director. "Yankees won. Don't let them move me." The activities director added a smiley face and a P.S. that said, "She says she loves you, but she says it like a secret." Grant moved out of the house and into a rental with furniture that looked like it belonged to a divorce. The state opened an investigation that used words like irregularity and noncompliance and asked someone at Portfield to stop using Gmail for official business. The school bond still passed because bonds rise on habits and kids need gym roofs. The county canceled the Golden Acres parcel deal. The developer issued a press release that used the word disappointed twice, and no one framed it. Cedar Grove learned how to say Nora's name without putting Grant's before it. At the hospital, a doctor who had once called her sweetheart in front of a patient called her Miss Henderson, like he meant it. A nursing student shadowed her and asked how she knew when to escalate, and Nora said, "When I've asked twice and the third time feels like I'm applying for permission to exist." The student wrote that down and then underlined it. Nora saw Grant at the grocery store one Tuesday in front of the rotisserie chickens. He looked smaller in person than he did in photos, or maybe she was finally seeing him at scale. Her body prepared to say, "Are you mad at me?" out of muscle memory. She lifted a finger, not unkind, and said, "We're done." And he nodded like a man who had finally heard a line that had always been true. At Betty's, a new waitress asked if Nora wanted pie. "Always," Nora said. And when she left, she sat on the blue wench because it had become a ritual, not a destination. A woman she had never met sat down beside her, fidgeting with the key bank envelope and not looking up. "Is this a safe place to start?" the woman said finally. "Yes," Nora said. "Take up space." The woman nodded, a small miracle that looked like nothing from far away and everything from here. They went inside, where the coffee was always fresh and the porch was always blue. There were days that were not sunrise. Days when Bev called crying because her friends at church had stopped sitting with her, and she wanted Nora to say she was sorry so Bev could stop being uncomfortable. Days when a rumor ran past Blue Porch in the shape of a woman with perfect eyebrows saying Nora had made a scene and hurt the campaign. Days when Millie's sister died and Nora sat on a plastic chair in a beige funeral home and thought about how much of a life gets put in a slideshow with stock music. On those days, Nora drove to Lake Erie and stood on the pier with her arms out to a sky that owed her nothing and gave anyway. She learned the names of the women whose names the world only knew as our volunteers. Tasha, who worked nights at the distribution center and still took her niece to daycare every morning because her sister had a shift that started at 5. Quinn, who could find an apartment that would accept Section 8 without making you eat the lease. Alma, who had left the man with a nice car and an empty soul and kept the houseplants at Blue Porch alive like a testimony. They taught her which judge was likely to listen and which one had decided to be weary this year and which landlord blinked when you said attorney. Some nights she fell asleep at the apartment above Betty's with court dockets open on the table and woke with the locket imprinting a small circle into her throat. Some morning she ran into Ruth in the alley and they shared a donut like teenagers. Ruth told her about her sister, who lived 30 years in an apartment with a door that stuck and a view of a parking lot, and had been happy in a way she only understood after she died. You don't need a view if you know what to look at. You don't need to be dazzling if you're faithful, she said, tying on her apron. In late fall, Blue Porch ran a coat drive that turned into a line that turned into a story. In winter, they opened the diner early on Sundays and let women sit in the back with coffee and not talk. In spring, Nora took a call from a woman at the county who said, "Don't tell anyone I said this, but check the bids on parcel 10, same pattern." Nora wrote it down and texted Leela, who replied with a thumbs up and a gif of a judge taking off her glasses. Sometimes at church, the pastor used phrases that made Nora roll her eyes in a way it took her 30 seconds to translate back into compassion. She started sitting with the woman in the second-to-last pew who laughed too loudly at nothing and cried at the choir and carried a purse the size of a carry-on. She started lighting candles in her kitchen when she did the dishes. She started calling her father on Tuesday nights and letting him tell stories about his knees. Grant called once in the spring because he had heard she was going around telling lies. She sat on the edge of the bed with the phone at her ear and listened until his voice turned into air. When he stopped talking, she said, "We use different definitions of lie. I use not true. You use not flattering." He said something she didn't write down. She said, "I have to go." And she did. When the state auditor's report came out, it used phrases like improper influence and lack of safeguards and contained an appendix full of emails that made Portfield sound like men in a conference room explaining to each other why poor people didn't mind being moved if you did it politely. The county commissioners adopted a new procurement policy that said vendor contact had to be logged, even when everyone swore it didn't matter. The press ran a small story on page 2. It didn't change the world. It changed 5 small things in one small place. Sometimes that has to be enough. Nora's mother had taught her to make pot roast in a Dutch oven, with carrots cut on the diagonal so they looked like they had a reason for being there. On a rainy night in May, Nora made pot roast for the women who came after the legal clinic because food after hard truth is a sacrament. Alma brought wine and Ruth made a salad that tasted like she had asked the lettuce who it wanted to be. They ate at the big table at the back of the diner because the restaurant had closed early for a church banquet, and they left the door unlocked in case a woman needed a bathroom and a place to pretend she was just washing her hands while she tried not to cry. "Do you ever miss the version of yourself you meant to be?" Quinn asked, and the room went quiet for a second, like the space between a diagnosis and a nurse saying, "We can handle this." I miss the version of me who thought she had to be smaller to be loved, but she didn't know me very well. Ruth laughed into her napkin. She said, "Put that on a mug. We'll sell it next to the register, next to the snow globes." In June, the Blue Porch got its 501c3 letter, which arrived looking like it had come to the wrong address. Nora held it up under the light and cried because the government had acknowledged something that had been true in quiet for a long time. On a sticky evening in July, a woman with a bruise turning yellow at the edge of her jaw sat on the blue bench and asked, "If I leave, where do I go between the leaving and the landed?" Nora said, "Here," and handed her a key to the apartment above Betty's. "It's not fancy. It rattles. It's safe." The woman's face did that thing faces do when they learned in front of you that they are allowed to believe a good thing is actually being offered. She took the key like it weighed more than it did. She asked, "Do I owe you?" "Later. Pay it forward. If you can't, sit on the bench and tell someone it's okay to take up space." Nora wrote down the names of women who moved through the apartment as if they were beads on a string. Carly, who worked the night shift at the nursing home and taught herself to nap sitting up. Tessa, who could fix a washer with a butter knife and a prayer. Miriam, who translated for her mother at doctor's appointments and cried when someone translated for her for once. They left notes under a magnet shaped like a rooster. "Thank you for the quiet. Thank you for the light through the east window. Thank you for the way the radiator sounds like a cat that loves me." In the fall, a young reporter came to Blue Porch and asked for the origin story because story needed to be told in shapes people recognized. Nora showed her the locket and the Lake Erie photo and the first legal pad with the sentence at the top. The reporter asked if she could take a photo of the note. "Only if you let me fix my hair," and then didn't fix it. The reporter asked at the end, pen poised like punctuation dependent on Nora's answer. "No," Nora said, and was surprised to hear it out loud. "I don't have room. He takes up enough on his own." Then, because it needed to be said, she added, "I don't forgive him either. Forgiveness is intimacy. I'm not intimate with him." At Christmas, Blue Porch hung paper snowflakes in the front window because children had cut them and they looked like being loved. Bev came in one afternoon and stood by the door like a person practicing penance. She didn't know, she said to Nora, which was and wasn't true. "You didn't ask," Nora said. "That's different." Bev nodded and set a check on the counter for the coat drive. It was a small check. It was also a confession. "I miss you," Bev said. And Nora said, "I hope you find new people to sit with." And that was kinder than what she felt. She started sleeping with the window open even in January because the apartment over Betty's did not believe in drafts so much as it believed in weather going through you. She liked the way the cold made the quilts earn their keep. On Thursdays, she worked the early shift and made it to the staff meeting just in time to pour the bad coffee before anyone else and write on the whiteboard in block letters so the back row could read without squinting. She started wearing red lipstick to the courthouse because it made her feel like a person who had decided to live in her face and not beside it. When she took the stand in a second hearing about Parcel 10, the judge didn't have to ask her to speak up. She said, "This line item exists inside a sentence that does not admit it exists." And someone laughed in the back like they'd just heard a joke about the weather in a town where the weather killed people and no one named it. Afterward in the hallway, a woman in a suit said, "I didn't know nurses could do that." And Nora said, "We can do everything. We just can't bill for it." In March, Millie died. It was a good death as far as deaths go. One long breath and then nothing. Nora sat with her the night before and talked about baseball and forgot to cry because Millie was more alive than most people even when she was asleep. At the memorial, the chaplain said Millie had been moved by love, not a developer. And Nora felt the sentence hit like a warm hand on a cold back. On the first warm Saturday, Blue Porch hosted a legal picnic, which was just hot dogs and a community education session with Lila under a string of paper lanterns. Children drew chalk hearts on the alley. A man who lived in the building across the way played guitar in his window without looking at them once. Nora watched a woman she didn't know take 3 deep breaths before walking through the gate like she had trained for it. "What are we?" Quinn asked, wiping ketchup off her wrist with a napkin. "A porch? A clinic? A rumor with merch?" "We're proof with receipts," Nora said, and Ruth wrote it down on a sticky note to put near the register in case it needed to be a mug. Not every story has a villain who leaves town. Grant stayed. He taught a class at the community college on public speaking. He dated an accountant who wore beautiful shoes. Sometimes he showed up at places where Nora had once been expected to stand beside him and smile. And he stood in those places alone, looking like a man who had finally discovered the distance between charisma and character. That was its own kind of justice, the quiet kind that doesn't trend. One night in June, Nora was sitting on the blue bench watching the last light invent itself across Main Street when a teenage girl stopped in front of her, clutching a folder like a raft. "My guidance counselor said to ask for you," the girl said without looking up. "I want to be a nurse. My mom says it's too hard for people like us." "It's hard for everybody," Nora said. "People like us do hard better than most." "How do I start?" the girl asked. "You come on Tuesday and we fill out the FAFSA, and you sit with Alma as she shows you how to correct a financial aid officer without apologizing. And you stop telling yourself stories about who you're allowed to be." The girl nodded and sat down. They watched an ambulance go by with its lights on, but no siren. "Do you still work at the hospital?" the girl asked. And Nora said yes, because being more did not require being less. Sometimes you get to know the exact moment a chapter closes. Sometimes it's just a Tuesday and you realize after lunch that you haven't looked over your shoulder all day. On one of those Tuesdays, Nora looked in the mirror of the ladies' room at the hospital and did not adjust anything. On one of those Tuesdays, she called her father, and after he told her about his knees and the price of gas, she said, "Dad, I'm okay." And she meant it. On one of those Tuesdays, she walked into Golden Acres with a bag of oranges, because Millie had believed oranges were proof God meant us to be bright. A new resident, Mr. Harlan, who had been a shop teacher and now told everyone how to fix things with glue that didn't claim to be Gorilla, asked her if she would sit and eat one with him. She did. The oranges were the kind you have to work at. The juice ran down her hand and she licked it off without apology. At Blue Porch, a woman sat on the bench and said, "Is it okay that I'm loud?" And Nora said, "Be loud." Another said, "Is it okay that I'm tired?" And Nora said, "Rest here." A third said, "Is it okay that I stayed?" And Nora said, "Yes, we help leavers and stayers." The porch did not measure anyone's worth by the volume of their pain or the price of their leaving. In August, a summer storm came in with black clouds like bruises and pushed rain sideways down Main. The neon coffee cup flickered and held. Ruth pulled chairs in. Alma rescued the fern. Nora stood in the doorway and watched the rain and thought about the minivan and the dealership lights and the voice on the speaker saying she was a lot. She smiled and thought, "Yes, I am." That night, the power went out, and the diner turned into a place lit by phones and candles stolen from church. People told stories because Wi-Fi had surrendered, and stories are the original internet. A man at the counter said, "You know, my granddad used to say," and the woman 3 stools down said, "Mine too." And Nora heard the sound of strangers siding with each other. When the lights came back, everyone clapped as if electricity were a person who needed encouragement. Ruth banged a pot with a spoon and said, "To the porch!" And everyone shouted back, "To the porch!" And it was silly and holy and exactly enough. The next morning, Nora woke to sunlight on the quilt and the radiator quiet for once. She made coffee and drank it slowly. She put on the locket not because she was superstitious, but because she had decided to carry her mother in a way that didn't hurt. She opened the window and listened to trucks on Main and a bird who believed in the day. She took the legal pad from the drawer where she kept things that wanted to be believed in and turned to a fresh page. At the top, she wrote, "Take up space." Under it, she started a list. Parcel trainings, intake hours, rides for court, Nora's hours at the hospital, Ruth's schedule, candles for the table, because Blue Porch had become a place where you could cry without apology, and candles make that feel permitted. The day went on like most days. Quiet urgencies, a woman needing a ride, a man asking if they had a number for a lawyer who wasn't scared of landlords, a teenager wanting to know if the FAFSA would count her grandma's check. She said yes and no, and we'll find out, and wrote names in a notebook with a pen that made her handwriting look more confident than she felt. She laughed at a joke. She ate a donut. She told Ruth to sit down for 5 minutes and then sat down herself because leadership is often modeling the thing you insist other people deserve. At dusk, a woman in a coat too thin for the weather stood by the bench and asked, without preamble, "Is this where I can say I don't know how to leave and also I don't know how to stay?" Nora nodded and patted the bench. The woman sat. They watched the neon coffee cup until it steadied into a shape that did not apologize for taking up space. "You don't need to apologize for taking up space," Nora said. "Not here, not anywhere." "How do you know?" the woman asked. Nora touched the locket and thought of the dealership and the emails and the judge and Millie and the blue bench and the radiator and the oranges and the way Ruth wrote phrases on sticky notes in case they needed to be printed on mugs later. "Because I tried shrinking. It didn't make anyone safer." The woman laughed unexpectedly. The laugh of someone who just found out a door was never locked. "Okay," she said. "Okay." They went inside then, because the air had turned and warm coffee is medicine if you take it with people. The bell over the diner door did that jingle that sounds like small joy, and Nora let herself think, just for a breath, that the world was not a machine designed to grind women down into yes. She would still deal with budgets and forms and commissioners who wanted to be thanked. She would still work nights and answer family calls and sit in courtrooms that smelt like old paper and men. She would still have to write letters and find rides and tell women they could leave and help them when they did and hold them when they didn't. None of that got lighter because she had learned to say no. But she would do it on a porch painted blue, with a bench that told the truth and a diner that stayed open 5 minutes past closing if anyone looked like they were about to be brave. She would do it with a locket that felt like a small sun at her throat. She would do it with receipts and a voice she no longer kept in a box with her mother's handwriting. She would do it as a woman who stopped asking if you're mad and started asking if you're ready. On the way home to the apartment above Betty's, she stopped by the hospital to drop off paperwork. The night shift had started. A tech named Diego was eating yogurt in the hall, and a resident was crying in the bathroom, and a janitor was singing along with a song only he could hear. Nora moved through it like a person who belonged to a place and to herself. Outside, Main Street looked like a movie with a small budget and no stars. She climbed the back stairs and turned the key. The apartment breathed around her. She put her bag on the chair. She took off her shoes. She stood by the window and watched the red of the neon coffee cup settle into the kind of night you can sleep inside. She didn't say a prayer. She said a promise. Tomorrow I will tell another woman to take up space. Tomorrow I will take up mine. She turned off the light, and the room agreed.